This event is part of the Kapanu project that we're running here at Brighton with colleagues from a range of other European universities. Kapanu is a project exploring the cartography of the political novel in Europe. And as my colleague Mark often says at these events, every term in that title is contested. We're contesting what the novel is, what the political is, what Europe is, and whether mapping is really something we want to endorse or not. And I'm really excited to be hosting this event and having this opportunity to have a conversation with Naomi Booth, who I'd like to welcome, who's joining us to talk about her most recent novel, Raw Content. For those of you who don't know Naomi, she's a professor of creative writing at Durham, an author and an academic. She's published many books, including her excellent previous novel, Sealed, which was nominated for the Not the Booker Prize in 2017, and Exit Management, one of The Guardian's best fiction books of 2020. When I originally conceived this event, I was thinking about the novels that Naomi had already published, and then this novel was published as we were in the project, and I'm really excited to be able to talk about this novel in particular because it relates to lots of my own interests around feminist philosophy, childhood, the politics of mothering and motherhood. So I'm really looking forward to having this conversation about this. Naomi's also a short story writer, and her first collection, Animals at Night, was published in 2022 and shortlisted for the Edgehill Short Story Prize. And Naomi's academic research has focused on literary depictions of the body, particularly the swooning body. And her monograph, Swoon, A Poetics of Passing Out, was published by Manchester University Press in 2021. So thank you so much for coming, Naomi. It's a real personal pleasure and honour for me as well, because Naomi and I first met in 2010 when we started our PhDs together at the University of Sussex. We started in the same intake. I think we last saw each other in 2013 after a night out at karaoke. Maybe the last time I went to karaoke, so it may need to be repeated at some point. And yeah, it's just really nice to see how interests have converged around these topics. Naomi, you've had a child in the intervening years. I haven't. So yeah, my interest in this doesn't come from personal experience, but I do have a mother, and I know about families, and yeah, my interest in psychoanalysis has led to my interest in mothering and the maternal. So really, really excited to talk to you about this. Naomi and I are going to talk for about 50 minutes, an hour, and we'll have time for questions. We're outside of term time, so we are going to have to make sure that we're out by 7. So we'll try and make sure there's enough time for us to have a drink and a bit of a chat afterwards. But yeah, there'll be time for you to ask questions and give your comments and thoughts on this excellent novel. So we thought that we would start with you reading a little bit from the start of the novel, Naomi, to set the scene for us.
Thank you so much, Jo, and I really appreciate the invitation to be here from you and your colleagues and all of you on this very warm night, coming out to hear me talk to Jo about this novel that is very much a Yorkshire winter novel. So this is going to require some imaginative travelling for us all this evening. So I'm going to read from a couple of different places in the novel to try to give you a sense of some of the things that it's bringing together. It tells the story of a character called Grace, whose sense of her life glitches. That's the word that comes up quite a lot in this novel, the glitches after the birth of her first child. It's about, I think, the way in which loving the body of an infant can be a form of madness. It's also very interested in the landscapes of childhood. And I'm going to start by reading from what's almost like a prologue that introduces the landscape in which Grace grew up. And I'm interested in the way that the landscapes of childhood revisit at moments of maximum vulnerability. And for Grace, that moment of maximum vulnerability is after giving birth. And I mean landscape both in the sense of the kind of social and familial context in which she grew up, but also literally a landscape to which she is very attached. It's a place called the Colne Valley in West Yorkshire, a place that's very beautiful, awesomely beautiful, and is also laced with threat to a young girl growing up in that landscape. I hope you'll get a sense of that from what I read now. I was born in the back of a Ford Fiesta, a mile shy of Huddersfield Royal Infirmary. As my mother screamed and my father caught me, purple and larded with vernix, in his shaking hands, Jacqueline Hill's body was being uncovered in the thick of nettles and dock and ragwort on a scrap of wasteland 20 miles away. She had disappeared the night before, becoming the final victim of the Yorkshire Ripper. I was born in the Colne Valley into a seam of abandoned mill. The landscape of my childhood was Sallandine Nook and Scar Bottom and Titanic mills. Derelict furnace chimneys and sawtooth roofs were as intrinsic to the valley as the skylarks and meadow pipits that rose in the sky above us to the Pennine moortops. I grew up in a house 10 miles as the crow flies from Saddleworth Moor, where children lay buried under gorse and heather in unmarked graves. If the crow were to fly up over Marsden Moor and Westmorden Reservoir to the forbidden and terribly beautiful places, to Dovestone's Edge and the Boggart Stones. My childhood was a map marked with danger zones, Titanic mills filled with broken glass and pigeon shit in which we were forbidden to play, the lanes and ginnels and car parks that run behind old coal yards and pubs in which we were forbidden to play, the secluded crescents of green space next to the canal where people dumped old sofas and chest freezers and tins of paint in which we were forbidden to play. Even the playground at the edge of our estate was to be accessed only in specific circumstances. It had to be daylight. It had to be before 7 in the evening. We were not to speak to strangers. Me and my sister must always stick together. We were never, ever to wander from the playground into the woods where people sniffed glue and worse. We were never, ever to walk up towards Scapegoat Hill or Marsden Moor. Me and my sister were cared for. We were bathed and fed and clothed. But as with many children, we couldn't have told you if we were loved. Our experience of care came in the form of a warning. I'm going to skip a little way into the novel now, and this is the point at which Grace and her partner bring home their new baby. The baby feeds and feeds in those first few days. She bleats whenever I put her down. We watch tutorials on how to change a nappy, and we learn about the different stages of baby feces, the thick tar-like meconium that comes first, flushing out everything the baby has ingested in the womb, then the mustard-coloured, scentless milk waste that follows. Ryan changes the baby and makes me cups of tea, and I sit on the sofa feeding her and asking the internet questions. The hours disappear like this. We make lists of possible names and stick them on post-it notes around the flat. Sylvia, Nancy, Courtney, Florence, Chrissy, Violet. None of these words fits our raw, wordless scrap of a baby. The baby yawns for the first time and her eyes dilate on contact with light. Her irises are a fickle, metallic colour that is difficult to decipher. Olive, amber, pewter. The baby feeds some more. I try out different positions, nesting on the sofa. I read about the 4th trimester, the idea that newborn babies need to remain cocooned by the caregiver's body even after birth. Newborn babies are softer and rawer than any other newborn mammal. A human baby needs a caregiver's body continually close to protect it, to pattern their breathing and to regulate their temperature. The baby needs my heartbeat to develop the rhythm of her own. My breasts are swelling with milk. They throb whenever the baby cries. My heart throbs too. I am euphoric still. We have made it through. We have made it through to the other side of birth, which is surely life. I have survived with only a tear and delivered this warm-blooded organ into my own arms. That first night at home together, we set up the Moses basket next to my bed. We lay the baby down to sleep with great ceremony. But of course, the baby will not sleep there. She wants my body. The nightlight is a small crescent of brightness in the dark blur of milk and skin and adrenaline that the night becomes. The baby makes such noises, such terrible tiny rasps and rattles and sighs, as though breathing is altogether too difficult, as though she might give it up on the turn of each breath. Half blind, she gasps all night long, searching for me with her mouth, searching for me with her tiny, broken cry. Ryan sleeps through most of this, but I listen all through the quiet hours. And in the middle of that first night at home, I watch the baby repeatedly flinch herself awake in the basket. I check on her breathing again and again, and the baby doesn't look like something new in the darkness then. The baby looks like something ancient and broken, an injured relic, dark sea fish dredged up from the midnight zone, sputtering up water, cawing pterodactyl of an infant. And this is just a day or so later. It should be easy, surely, to relate to my own infant. I didn't spend much time around babies before Rosa was born, but people look after babies every day without any special training or qualification. This is your job now, the midwife had told me, and I've always been good at my job. I'm reading the literature, swatting up on baby care, learning all the lingo and parenting philosophies. But the baby is not relatable. The baby is not even recognisably human. She still rasps and wheezes through the night. When she needs to feed, she noses blindly like a newborn terrier or ferret. The back of her body is all bone, her little shoulder blades like vestigial wings. She has small tufts of hair on her ears, which are pointed and battish. The stump of umbilical remained part of her belly for days before it turned black and splintered away like rotten tree bark. The soft spot on Rosa's head is the most alien thing of all. The skull not yet fully formed, the bones softening at the top into, I don't know what, tissue, organ, brain, covered with only the thinnest veneer of skin. Rosa's soft spot pulses in and out with her heartbeat. It looks alive. Its awful raw throb. The baby is not at all relatable. The truth is, she frightens me. And yet I am consumed by caring for this weird little lozenge of almost life. Unprecedented alien rawness of the baby, my baby, broken bird, pulsing brain, internal organ of a love object.
Thanks, Naomi. That was great. I really love the idea of the child as this alien presence, you know, this injured relic or pterodactyl. It seems like in the novel, the process of kind of becoming a mother and having a child is quite a surprise, quite a new thing for Grace. Prior, you said in the extracts that you were reading, you know, this is my job now, and I've always been good at my job. There's a kind of transformation that's going on in the process of becoming a mother. And I also thought it's really interesting the way that the first extract that you read starts with her birth, with Grace's birth. And then the next extract kind of moves us on to her engagement with her own child and her relationship there. So, yeah, I was wondering, if you could say a little bit about the one or both of those aspects, you know, the transformation that's taking place in Grace, and also maybe kind of how her own past is sort of feeding into that in some way.
Thanks, Jo. Maybe I'll say a little bit more about Grace as a character, because the bit that's moved out there is kind of what Grace is doing, how she's living her life before the baby comes along. And the title of the novel, Raw Content, comes from Grace's work. So Grace works as a legal editor. She tags and prepares content after legal judgments have been delivered. So she's part of this massive workforce now of people who are processing information that we all read every day online. She's a kind of specific version of that, working for a law publisher. So she's someone who's become very efficient at dealing with very difficult materials in a kind of cauterized way. She receives these judgments as raw content, and her job is to look at them grammatically and then to tag them so that they'll be discoverable online. So she's a character, I think, who's become really efficient at dealing with the raw content of her own life and of the world around her by using certain systems, sticking to the principle of certain systems. And she's very sort of invested in that system before the baby comes along. And the baby is a shock in a number of ways. The baby is an unplanned pregnancy, but also the experience of birth is a shock. And I've this is the second time I've chosen to write about birth in a first-person narrative, where I'm quite keen to deliver an account of giving birth. So both my first novel, Sealed, and this novel have, I think The Guardian reviewed Sealed as admirably gory, but I've become, quite committed to writing birth scenes. So this is part of the shock for Grace, I suppose, who's become very good at keeping things at a certain distance. The kind of shock of the experience of birth causes some of those systems of managing the world to collapse for Grace. And I, as sort of outside of novel writing, I've become increasingly interested in the way in which birth is experienced as a shock. And I mean that for the best possible births as well, not just the ones that we would usually think of as traumatic, for example, and why in particular there seems to be a widespread experience of shock. I think there's in a lot of writing about early motherhood at the moment, the shock of birth. And I have some hypotheses about, both about the conditions of giving birth in isolation being quite different, as you were suggesting, sort of in isolation from family structures. That might mean you've had a lot of first-hand experience of birth. I was watching a recent documentary about Jane Austen and was reminded in it that she had attended many births by the time she was 17. So by the time she first wrote a novel, Jane Austen had attended many family births, which included all sorts of outcomes, including, the most disastrous ones for mothers and babies. So this idea that we've lost that first-hand experience of attending birth, and that might be part of why birth is now, I think, almost universally experienced in talking about our specific cultural experiences in the West and specifically in the UK, but why that might be experienced as a shock in a way that feels new to me from previous accounts of birth. And the other thing, I suppose, is just that I think giving birth and raising an infant gives the absolute lie to many of the fictions that we're raised with as part of our, as part of what it means to be a good self-sufficient neoliberal subject. Just absolutely is obliterated in the early days of parenting. The dyad, I think pregnancy is a very weird experience, but you maybe expect it to be. But the early, that idea of the fourth trimester that many of us are exposed to now, that an infant is not an individual being when they're born, is very, very shocking to those of us who've been raised to be good self-sufficient subjects in the way that Grace has. That's part of the shock for her, I think.
Yeah, you describe it at one point, or you describe the baby, who they come to call Rosa, at one point as my vital organ, which really struck me when I was rereading it as a kind of a way of noting kind of the inseparability of the primary caregiver and the child at that early point in the child's life, the absolute dependence, particularly if the caregiver's breastfeeding.
Yeah.
And I noticed very much in the novel that the father, Ryan, the young guy who, you know, she's been having a relationship with, not that formal, but, you know, they've ended up with this pregnancy. He's kind of on the edges, isn't he, for quite a lot of the novel. And at the end, she kind of realizes, oh, yeah, Ryan's been there the whole time, because she's been so immersed in that very physical, dependent relationship between her and the baby.
Yeah.
Breastfeeding, you know, I really appreciate your descriptions of the breastfeeding, you know, and how long it takes. And that's another thing that comes up a lot, isn't it? I mean, I have no idea how long breastfeeding takes. And
it's
the character
it's
has
shocking.
no idea. It takes hours.
Yeah. Hours and hours, like a working week.
Yeah.
Breastfeeding in the first few months if you're breastfeeding. Yeah, it's a shock, isn't it?
It's an absolute shock.
What I'm talking about. I think these physical details are still really absent from mainstream storytelling. I remember the writer Jessie Greengrass, when her wonderful novel Sight came out a few years ago, and she reflected on how rare it still is to have accounts. I think this is probably true for most physical experiences that we think of as abject, right? You don't see a lot of fiction that thinks about catheterization, for example, or, you know, like fiction of the body is still not part of most mainstream novel writing. But her point was specifically about birth, and she gave that great example from Madame Bovary of Charles telling us that her confinement begins at 6 a.m. when the sun rises, and then there's a literal white space on the page, and it's a girl. That's the, you know, so the white space where any narration of birth can be. And I think we're still at the very start, really, of beginning to write into that.
Someone on the other side of the door, I'm guessing, from where it's happening, and so
it's off screen.
Yeah. And do you think that's about experience, and, you know, historically, who's been doing the writing? Well, historically, mainly men who wouldn't necessarily have been having those experiences, but today, obviously, you know,
I don't think it's just about that. I mean, Jane Austen experienced that all, and it's not in the novels, is it? We've not got that kind of I think it's about maybe about how much of the visceral the novel has historically been able to incorporate, particularly, I suppose I'm thinking particularly of female viscera. You know, I'm quite interested in, I'm going to really put you off any of my books now, but I'm very interested in placentas as well as babies. You know, the fact that the baby is an organ, but women do grow another organ if they gestate a baby. And, you know, so I think it's partly, of course, about who's writing novels, but also about what the novel can accommodate at different points in its history. I teach on a course on the novel up at Durham, and we were reading Moll Flanders this year, and I find it really fascinating to return to that novel and think about what it's possible for him to narrate about the difficulty of life for a working class woman at that point in time. So certain things it's possible for him to narrate, but Moll loses several of her children to infant mortality. Literally, that is given in parentheses. It's one sentence in parentheses about the death of one of her. You know, the novel clearly, and he wants to tell us something about the experiences of women like Moll, but the novel cannot at this point in time tell us anything about the reality of birthing and of infant mortality, for example.
And that's about the norms of the form at the time, would you say, and kind of reception and consumption, as much as the experience of those producing?
I think it's probably a mixture of a lot of different things, but this makes me think, I suppose, of from the start, the way in which the novel and a novelist it has to exist with their mind on a number of different things, one of which is the market. So the novel does emerge as a commercial form. You know, I, as much as any other novelist, like to make grand claims for the politics of the novel, but we are
good.
split. But, you know, the novel has, I think the novel often aspires to a wide readership, and that's always a negotiation, and it's also not always in the author's hands. You know, editors publishers have power here to say what might be acceptable to a larger populace at any time. So I think there's a real negotiation going on at different points in history.
Do you think then that there's a change taking place now? Because, you obviously have written these novels. Is there more of an appetite, do you think? Is it more commercially viable to?
Yeah.
Why do you think that would be?
I think there's a massive change for me in the last 20 or 30 years. There's been a real proliferation of accounts of early motherhood. And I think there is a demonstrable readership for that now. And there's maybe just a critical mass as well of writers who are insisting on this as the proper stuff of novels.
Yes, bringing what's been in the shadows into the light in some regard. I mean, this is something I'd like to pursue with you around the kind of what gets written into the symbolic, and the way in which things that have historically been feminized have been kind of excluded from the philosophical tradition, but also the literary tradition. So, the refusal to write about the body, or the idea that writing about the body isn't something that is commercially viable, tells us something, doesn't it, about the dominant forms of subjectivity at a particular time, the way in which the body challenges a particular invulnerable, individualized, self-reliant conception of the self, because it puts our kind of raw animality, our humanity, our vulnerability on show, doesn't it? So yeah, I mean, I'm quite interested in thinking about that. But maybe that's something we can come on to in a bit when we think a little bit about the politics of the novel. I wanted to go back to the question around Grace, and about the kind of her response to becoming a mother. We've spoken a bit about the body and the kind of shock of becoming a mother, but there's also something quite specific that happens to Grace that doesn't happen to all people who gestate babies. She develops a particular disorder, as it's often called in kind of common mental health parlance. I wonder if you could say a bit about what happens to Grace.
Yeah. I'm always a bit unsure about how much of this to narrate, and in fact in what language to narrate it, because I think the novel is attempting to sort of put a number of different discourses into play about how we might understand what's happening to Grace and how she might understand what's happening to her. And so I suppose the way that will make this conversation possible is if I say that Grace experiences intrusive thoughts about what might happen to the baby, but she doesn't experience them as intrusive thoughts. She experiences them as premonitions when they first occur. I am now, having published the book, I am becoming surer and surer that this is in fact close to a universal experience, because almost everybody who I've spoken to who's read the book, who has gestated a baby, has shared that they also had these thoughts. So I'm now kind of moved from thinking of this as a common experience to thinking this might actually be a universal experience. So people have disclosed all sorts of visual, very disturbing flashes of experience in the early stages of raising an infant, which might be explicable for all of the kinds of physical pressures that people are under after just having given birth. But these are things like seeing yourself drop an infant down a staircase, watching your infant drown. I won't share any more of them because they're very upsetting things to think about, but people experience these. I think all parents experience these, but I think they can be particularly disturbing and shocking for women who've just given birth, for birthing mothers. What happens to Grace? Not everybody develops a disorder. So Grace does develop what she comes to recognise as a disorder, or obsessive compulsive disorder, because of her intense anxiety and fixation on those images, and those images proliferate for her.
Yeah, that's interesting. So you said that the intrusive thoughts you think are a common thing, but maybe the disorder isn't. I guess it raises the question for me of why did you choose to have your character develop in that direction?
Yeah. Partly because I experienced intrusive thoughts and it felt to me incredibly important to write about. I think I quite often write from what I'm also now beginning to think of as glitches. So I write from experiences that feel really difficult to talk about. And I write also from experiences of enthusiasm that feel really difficult to talk about, or things that feel like love objects that are not acceptable love objects. So it's not just that my writing is only interested in the really most difficult experiences, but I am interested in that too. And after I had a baby, it was like normal conversation became sort of impossible. All of the things that I was expected to talk about and respond to were it was so dissonant with what I was experiencing internally. So that began to feel to me to be a really important thing to try and write into and to try and find a form to explore. I think whenever I experience that real dissonance between, which like most of us experience most of the time, right? Because we live in a political context that causes a great deal of dissonance for most of us. But when you get to a really acute point in that, that's often for me a moment that feels like it's almost annihilating because there is no way to speak about it. And that for me is where writing often happens, as a way to try and do that.
Wonderful. It's great that you're doing that and giving voice to something that probably is more common than we realise and isn't really discussed. I'm sure there's a lot of people who would read this and go, oh, thank God for that. I know my experience of literature when I was growing up was the access to the inner worlds of the characters made me realise, oh God, this complexity is everyone, it's going on for everyone. Thank God for that. So this seems like an important dimension of that.
Thank you. Yeah, I hope that's true.
I had a question, maybe I want to put it a similar thing in slightly a different way, and maybe it's not a fair question to ask you, I don't know, but I'm wondering about, you might want it. I became intrigued about the question. I don't think there's one answer to this, but the question of where those fears come from. And whether you thought to me, it seemed like it's kind of overdetermined in many ways. There's so many different ways we could think about where those fears come from.
Yeah, it is kind of an impossible question, but it's a good one to try and think about. So, I mean, I guess I'm interested in anxiety in a more generalised sense. So obsessive compulsive disorder is often thought of as a kind of specific form of anxiety. And that's definitely something I've thought about in earlier work as well. And for me, thinking about the political dimensions of this in particular, I think that we're in an absolute epidemic of anxiety. Anxiety seems to be becoming maybe ambient affective experience for most of us at the moment is anxiety, and there are big political reasons for that, and very conscious right now of us all watching horrendous things play out around the world while things around us, the program, the university continues as normal.
It's a lovely day. To sing it here, yes, but not everywhere.
I think that dissonance it does get individualized as anxiety, and pathologized as anxiety. So that's a kind of bigger, more
disease with the environments we're living in.
But I guess in terms of Grace's particular character and what she does or how she responds to that anxiety, I think there's also a really important connection for her with work and the place that work has taken. And I'm really I've done my own research about OCD, but I'm also really lucky to have some colleagues at Durham who are working on critical thinking through OCD, and they've introduced me to a number of different ways of thinking about this. But I'm interested in the faith that Grace has in works to somehow save her, work within a particular system that might save her. And I think that links to historical understandings of condition that was once referred to as scrupulosity. You know, we have these, and Grace kind of does a bit of digging around the history of OCD, but these kind of historical examples of very overzealous nuns, for example. So people who have always perhaps believed that a certain system or a certain set of observances might save them from the things that they're anxious about, so sin or their children falling ill or whatever it might be.
And you list some big names, don't you, in the novel?
Yeah. I mean, there's a lot of Darwin, you know, Samuel Johnson, who had a thing about touching things a certain number of times, walking in particular ways, all sorts of historical examples of people practicing certain kinds of rituals in a way that might, that might feel protective to them. And some of my colleagues who are working on OCD really see this as a creative practice as well, as a kind of an active, unconscious but creative attempt to deal with anxiety, you know, fashioning new rituals when perhaps the collective rituals that are available to us are not cutting the mustard or have vanished, maybe.
It's a form of containment, isn't it? It's a way of trying to make things safe.
Yeah, this is
as magical as it is.
Yeah, there's a researcher at the University of York at the minute who's working on trying to pioneer new collective rituals for people with OCD, so where people would get together and try and kind of harness that. Oh, we're trying to make something. It's been very individualized. I think OCD is still a condition where people have a very limited idea of what it involves, and it's to do with pressing a light switch on and off many times before you can leave the house. And he's really trying to rethink what ritual might mean, for example.
Well, rituals, it's a form of holding, isn't it? You know, I'd get Winnicott in there somewhere at some point. But yeah, you know, and I think that idea of a kind of creating collective rituals in response to the anxieties that people are feeling, taking those individual anxieties and rituals and kind of trying to collectivize them, because that seemed like a very kind of important aspect of the novel. You've already touched on it, but you know, the absence of connection, the isolation that your main character feels seems also like something that's really feeding into that anxiety and those fears. That, I mean, she obviously has a few people around her, but the network of support isn't what it might have been or might be in different societies or ways of organising.
The network has failed. And I think this is also maybe especially important for her. She's someone who has worked hard at being at a distance from her family for good reason. But that also means that a kind of traditional network of holding is not in place.
I was interested as well. I mean, something that I think would be nice to speak about a little more is the kind of intergenerational aspect of those fears as well. You know, the novel seems to be saying something about how Grace's early experiences of care might be shaping the experiences that she's having with her own daughter. Is that an element of it for you?
Yeah, it is. And that's maybe a kind of obvious point to make. One of the things that I'm also really interested in that happens to Grace as she's trying to facilitate the baby reaching developmental targets, which, you know, you briefly become obsessed by, I think, when you're a new parent. And something very strange is happening to her in response to that. So she feels that she is devolving, that she's going backwards, that she's kind of revisiting old wounds, old sites.
Stuff's getting opened up.
Yeah. So there's a kind of regression for Grace as a character in this sort of painfully ironic way. So one example of that is what's happening with heartbeat as well. So she's aware that the mother's heartbeat is meant to provide a pattern somehow. I don't know how this works. It's a magical, wonderful and terrifying thing about infants, but they pattern their heartbeat on the mother's heartbeat. So Grace experiences the kind of erratic, out of control sense of her own heartbeat. So rather than steadying the baby, the baby is actually sort of, I suppose, sending her backwards into a kind of physical and emotional and mental chaos. No one's going to buy the book.
It's a great book. You
There
really
are some
should.
jokes as well. But yeah.
The language of the book is great. You know, I really got the sense of her as someone who liked to have a good time.
Yes, she did.
Knows how to have a good time, not only in her teenage years, but also, yeah, going out with her friends and various things she gets up to in hotel rooms in Brighton. I won't say anymore. I mean, there's a point in the novel that struck me because I'm quite interested in that question of maternal subjectivity. I think on one level it is quite obvious to say, obviously, our experiences when we're infants sort of are feeding into our own caregiving activities. But I'm quite interested in the ways that process is influenced by our own experiences of children previously. So Joan Raphael Leff, for instance, argues that, whenever anyone becomes a primary caregiver, they're likely to be returned into this kind of set of sensations around smells and substances that remind them unconsciously of their own early experiences. But because as a society, we're often so alienated from children until we become parents in these often isolated situations. When we do become parents, that stuff kind of comes back. It's like an overwhelm, because we haven't had the opportunities to work it through previously. So I'm quite interested in the interrelation of those different, the social factors that are driving the fear, and that very kind of personal psychic experience, that the inherently psychosocial dimensions of those experiences.
Yeah, I didn't know that theorist, and I was so glad that you mentioned them to me because it felt so resonant for me in terms of what I was trying to explore here, and the kind of the fascination that Grace has with this, like literally with shit, with this kind of tracking of the kind of feces that the baby is meant to produce in the first few days, the real kind of raw animal stuff of early parenting, which is both, I think, a kind of, it's a bewildering joy to her, those physical aspects. This is where I think the newborn is quite different from how people relate to even the figure of the baby or the figure of the child in its absolute kind of abject alien quality. And she's sort of entranced by that and disturbed, really deeply disturbed by it.
I mean, I think that brings us on maybe to thinking a little bit about the figure of the child. One of the things that I was thinking about when I was rereading the novel, we've got maybe sort of 10 minutes left for us to chat. So I thought it'd be good to kind of maybe move. I think everything we've said is about how political the novel is in so many ways. But one of the things that really stood out about it for me in Grace's experience is that this encounter with this newborn is this like radically transformative experience. And really what is so transformative about that is partly the inherent vulnerability, dependence, of the child. Partly the fears are about the fears of breaking the child, or that they are so incapable of looking after themselves at this point. And so I guess I'm thinking about the kind of broader political significance of the child and Grace's experience, and maybe the neonate, we might say, in particular. I was drawn to a couple of things that you talk about in the text on page 185. I'm sure you remember it well. You say that Grace is, I am in mourning for my baby's future. And that kind of really made me think of a bigger question around futurity in our own society. And children are often figures of futurity and figures of hope. And I was thinking about how useful the figure of the child might be politically in kind of critiquing injustices and violences that are ongoing in our society, and at the same time how we're at a particular moment where our commitment or our belief in the future is also so kind of tenuous with the environmental crisis we're living through.
Yeah, this is really interesting and really knotty for me. So that idea of the child, the figure of the child in futurity, which has been, is
there in your first novel, Sealed, isn't it, really?
Yeah.
The not being able to give birth because of the environmental crisis.
And the child is clearly very politically useful at certain moments for critiquing violence. So right now, for example, the child is the ultimate civilian casualty, right? So we see the child, the children of Gaza are the ultimate in terms of thinking about how we might mobilize around protecting civilians. I think child poverty, the child is a really important figure there for political mobilization. I also know, of course, about the ways in which the child can be of an extremely conservative notion of protecting the future. I'm thinking, of course, of Lee Edelman and No Future, and the way in which the reproduction of the figure of the child can just be the reproduction of of a particular
heteronormative future.
Yeah, and we see this in America. The pro-natalist movement in America is a great example of this. I think what has been true for me, and what is maybe true for Grace, is that actually some of the most devastating insights of maternity are the same as those insights of queer theory. Having a child does produce more death. One of the terrible things about having a child is reckoning with that child's death. So there's a kind of overlap for me in a maternal experience and some of those insights of queer theory. I'm also really interested in Jack Halberstam's work on the child as a queer figure, which doesn't work with the kind of pro-natalist movement, that children aren't actually, anybody who parents knows that children do not come out as small adults. They are radically wild, weird, perverse beings. And so any real attention to the child, I think, does reveal that the child is a queer subject. And that's another,
norms, and does this, the naturalness of them. Yeah, great. I think we should probably move to questions soon, but I know we're going to have another reading from you. Maybe we could take the reading and then maybe have a bit of a chat about that, and then we'll go to
Sure. I thought I would just read a little bit from the end of the novel, because one of the things at the end of the novel is thinking about is what it might mean to be in a recovery narrative. So the different kinds of systems that are offered to Grace for thinking through what she's experienced. So I'll just read a little bit. There's a chapter in which she ideas for understanding what she's experienced kind of proliferate in her own mind. So I won't read the whole chapter, but I'll just read a couple of examples that I think might be most interesting to you, Jo, thinking more explicitly about the politics of what she's experiencing. So, I am living in a recovery narrative most of the time. I have a new content management system for my thoughts, and I tag aberrant images as anxiety so that they can be filed away correctly. But I have my own theories too. Analogies proliferate in my mind, post hoc philosophies that cause glitches in the new filing system. For instance, I remember how I lived before Rosa, the way I could edit my cases without reading them, gliding over the details, the way my personal life ricocheted between acute sensitivity and total recklessness. Perhaps the pain of being alive was slow to emerge for me. It bloomed after giving birth. It's like when you burn your fingertips on a hot tin and you feel nothing at first. I'm fine, you say, I can hardly feel it, but the burn grows slowly until days later, all you can feel is the pulse of that pain in your fingertips. Loving an infant is deferred effect. For instance, I listened to a podcast about scurvy. I'm listening to lots of programs now, trying to expand my thoughts as I feed Rosa and settle her at night. And I discover that in severe cases of scurvy, the body cannot heal itself. Vitamin C is needed to make collagen, which supports the structure of blood vessels, as well as the production of scar tissue. For centuries, sailors lost their teeth, blood pooling in their mouths and under the skin, blood leaking into their internal organs, their bodies reeking of rot. And here is the kicker. In the final stages of scurvy, injuries that healed long ago, that were hidden by collagen, begin to reappear. Bones re-break, old wounds split back apart. And then I think, oh, fuck, that's it. Having a baby forces you to move backwards through your own injuries. It dissolves all your superficial healing. Loving an infant is morbid regression. For instance, this isn't my problem. The problem is endemic to the organisation of parenthood, to the privatisation of the task of parenting, and to the nuclear family, to the belief that the right product, the right schedule, the right approach to feeding and weaning, the right sleep training, the right parenting philosophy will solve the problems of being alive. I know from devising workflows and robust systems that nothing important should be totally dependent on just one person. You should never only be one person deep. But mothers are told they must protect their infants from everything, from childhood illnesses and secondary smoke inhalation and malnutrition and disordered eating and racial injustice and depression and poverty. Mothers are charged with somehow keeping their children safe from all the failings in the world. And how can one person possibly do that? Loving an infant is a political tragedy.
Thanks, Naomi. I really love that section. I really like the way you're commenting there on the kind of discourses around parenting that tend to emphasize an individualized parental responsibility. And also the way in which the first extract that you read around bones re-breaking really kind of picks up on some of those themes about, how re-entering that early kind of dyadic situation on the other side allows space for these wounds to be opened up. I think in some sense that the quote that you finished with there really kind of answers the final question that I had for you. You said loving an infant is a political tragedy, and I was gonna, because we're concerned here with the political novel, it would be amiss for me not to ask you about your sense of this as a political novel. Often political novels are seen as novels that are about, the state or ideology or big events historically. Do you see this as a political novel, and does that term have meaning for you?
I do, but I'm the wrong person to ask, aren't I? Because I'm doing that. But yeah, I mean, I think that because I understand the individual makes no sense to me without the political. So that's one way of thinking about that question for me, that I'm interested in really intimate experiences and the kind of psychic damage that my characters carry. And that for me often does lead to novels, I think, that feel very interior. But for me, that undertaking is to understand or to think about or to set in motion how that character comes to be in the context of the world that surrounds them. I think also when you're putting a novel together from a sort of craft point of view, if you like, you're thinking about a network of relations. So for me, that's another way to think about the novel as what will I bring into the purview of this? What does this begin with for me? What are the parameters of understanding this particular character?
So there's a kind of philosophy of subjectivity at work in designing a character, for want of a better word.
Yeah, or putting them into play, putting into play different forces around them as well.
Yeah, I mean, I would agree that I think the novel is really successful in kind of demonstrating the way in which our subjectivities are shaped by the political forces, political, social, economic forces around us, and it gives us access to that interiority. It's a profoundly psychosocial form. But I think as well, another thing that I find really, and it kind of returns to the point I was making earlier about when we were talking about the body and the visceral, I think what you're doing here is deeply political because, as we've said, historically, motherhood and mothering are practices that are written out of literature. And there's often a sense of mothers as objects in the dominant philosophical and literary tradition rather than as subjects. And for me, thinking about the relationship between social and symbolic change, giving space, voice, symbolic space to those narratives is a fundamental part of transforming that system, because we need to change the knowledge that is circulating in that system if we want to transform it, I think.
Yeah,
I think the novel's contributing to that.
Thank you, Jo. It's a very kind thing to say. I think you reminded me about irrigare. That the symbolic order is matricidal. Exactly, so if nothing else, I suppose I'm insisting on mother figures being at the heart of the novels that I write. Another thought crossed my mind there, but it has disappeared.
Maybe it'll come back to you. Thank you so much, Naomi. That was excellent. We've got about 15 minutes for questions and discussion. Yes.
Thank you. It sounds amazing, Robert. My name's Maggie. I run an organisation locally called Mothers Uncovered, which supports mothers with the adjustment to motherhood, which everyone doesn't know that we work with antidepressants. I'm sure you can understand when you're studying it. Certainly everything you've said chimed with the many hundreds of women we work with and all talk about intrusive thoughts. And I personally advocate them addressing this as well, because I think it's a much misunderstood and interesting time. We did a podcast and we did a book as well called The Secret Life of Mothers, all about that kind of hidden wonder in mothers. So I was interested about the dark times. So what we noticed in the last few years is the mothers that were pregnant or birthed or looking after small children around the time of the pandemic, their sense of self was even more shattered. So we would get one woman every 18 months who would say something like, it would be better if I wasn't around anymore, to several women every year saying that. So it seems like they're completely destroyed by what happened in the world. I read a book recently about the very air that you were breathing would kill you, and it would fade into that. So I wonder when is your novel set in a particular year?
It's pre-pandemic. I don't name the year in the novel, but it is pre-pandemic, because I think, as you say, lots of the anxieties that are being voiced in the novel were intensified during the pandemic, and lots of those. The pandemic, I guess, is a real intensification of the confinement that many new parents feel anyway. The world disappearing. So I think that, understandably, that would be a real intensification of the difficulties of parenting. But yeah, I did think of it as pre-pandemic, partly because I didn't want to suggest that these experiences were only produced by the pandemic. So I did wonder about Grace being confined as part of the pandemic, for example. But I actually wanted her to have as good an experience as possible, if that makes sense, of birth. That's another reason why she doesn't sustain, for example, very common birth injuries, because this for me is a kind of exploration of birthing in some of the best conditions. So that's one of the reasons for setting it pre-pandemic.
And the baby feeds well.
Yeah.
I mean, that's even pre-pandemic, the kind of the level of shock you talk about has certainly come to me and just about every other mother I've spoken to. So it's important to state even just the normal process of that is in itself quite a shocking thing to go through.
Yeah, and I'm really glad you've used that term matrescence as well. I think it's such a helpful one. I know Lucy Jones's work on that as well, and actually beginning to yeah, to name this as a really important transformation feels really important. Ready?
I've got a quick comment and then a top question. But I was really interested in your use of the word glitch.
Yeah.
Because in the manosphere, it's a very well-known term, which means when the matrix glitches and you see the world for what it is, and it's a moment of revealing the reality, revealing itself. But I was interested in you use glitch, but it's an affective sense. It's the absolute opposite, where this dissonance is entirely negative. Where in the manosphere, it's the idea that we see, I've taken the correct pill and we see what it is. So I don't know if you were aware of that.
It's at the edge of my awareness. I'm probably unconsciously aware of it.
Good place for it to
Yeah,
Yeah.
But obviously, I know of this through the Matrix. I actually think the glitch is both things in this novel. So it is both kind of catastrophic, but also there is some process of revelation for Grace through it too. And more in a more banal way, it's also to do with the work that she does and the way in which if she doesn't do her work correctly, the system glitches.
Right, and my proper question was around care, and around care, like freedom can be kind of conceived as positive and negative. You can have freedom to and freedom from. And it seemed that you were started off talking about care, especially Grace's own care, as a sort of a negative care, as in like, don't do that, don't do this, I'm going to keep you away from the woods. And then it seemed that in the early part you read, Grace seems to have a positive notion of care, with care for, care to do. And then at the end, when you read that wonderful section at the end, it seemed that she's almost repeating a negative version of care, of like, I'm keeping my baby from. So maybe you can say something about the nature of kind of the dialogues of care.
Yeah, thank you. I think you're absolutely right. One of the things we haven't talked about, but which is maybe relevant here, is that Grace's father is a police officer in the novel. So there are definitely systems of care that she is involved in that are to do with the authority of the state, and to do with historic violence there, and to do with a particular case that her father has been involved in as well, that is about harm coming to a child. So I'm definitely interested in how these overlapping systems of care play out in Grace's relationship to her child, and the way in which she is sort of moving at different stages through different versions of care herself, and what that might mean, and what and the way in which so many of these systems of care have been straightforwardly damaging. There's a point where her father warns her and her sister, who is a character who's sort of gone on a very different path from Grace, but warns them never to get in a car. He's a police officer. He warns them never to get in a car with police officers, for example. So all of this ways in which different systems of care might in fact be covert systems of damage and violence. Yeah.
Yeah, that carceral logic of care is quite evident in that the prologue's description, isn't it? You're forbidden to play. Shouldn't be doing this. And I really got a sense from that of, you say about we knew we were cared for, but we didn't know if we were loved. And I mean, I think that really kind of gets at those different logics of care, because what I was reading there was an account of emotional neglect on some level. The material needs are met, but there's something missing in the kind of care, and it's more controlling rather than enabling.
Touching on that, there's a way in which when you have a baby, suddenly you understand your own mother much better, don't you? So does Grace's mother come into people?
Yeah, she's estranged from her mother, but she does, towards the end of the novel, there's an important kind of scene in which she goes to visit her mother with the baby for the first time. Yeah, and I think you're right, most people do entirely revise their sort of their relationship with their mother at the point where they begin mothering. I think that can work in a range of ways. That can be both sort of something.
I both understood my mother better. It's like showing me what.
Yeah.
She could always be the kind of goddess. You know.
And there can also be real, I think there can be a real, there can be some very profound and difficult revisions that happen internally. For instance, if you fall in love with your baby in a particular way that makes you realise your mother didn't fall in love with you in quite that same way. You know, there are lots of ways in which if you're trying to parent in a particular way and you become conscious that your parents didn't, that can be acutely painful too, I think.
Questions.
Yeah. Those are some of the questions that might come up, but yeah, a range of questions about what things could have been like, for example, that are not just all the mother's fault either, but you know, that what could a person be like? What could I have been like in different circumstances that come up when you're raising a child? Yeah.
Any more questions?
That was really provocative and interesting. This is gonna sound clumsy because I don't have a formulated question, but I'm thinking about writing about birth from literature. I think Joseph that you also write short stories and novels, and because we've been dealing with birth and philosophy, Hannah Arendt, and then Veronica Bregg, things that Hannah Arendt doesn't capture the physicality of giving birth. Her kind of natality is too abstract. And yet, compared to what you're doing, what Carl Bregg is doing is too abstract. So it's the end that you manage to capture the visceral aspects of it. But also, like, I don't know if you know Carl Bregg's work, but you also manage to put birth in such a way that you can really kind of idealize the figure of the mother or the relationship between the two, but you also pay critical attention to the vulnerability of the caregiver. And you know, the glitch, but also the intrusive thoughts, and also just focusing on the newborn as opposed to the child, what gives you to understand that complexity, and to put the body really at the center. So I'm thinking, you know, when you get in philosophy, even when we do try to put the body at the center, we can keep failing to, because we don't have the language to do this. And it seems to me that your book really manages to get to that kind of phenomenological experience of giving birth and what it does to the mother, and how to think about the relationship between the caregiver and the newborn in a way that I think philosophy always kind of, it's like one step behind in a way.
Thank you. That's very kind to say. I don't know enough about phenomenology, but I am often thinking about our relation to the senses, and I come at this through maybe a slightly different route. Just thinking about what Terry Eagleton says about capitalism plundering our relationship to our senses. And I'm really interested in work that attempts to either capture that process of plundering or to do some work in, I don't know what the opposite of plunder would be. What would it be? Repopulate the senses in some way, especially around maternity. So thank you.
Can I push on something? And I'm sure this is the right point to talk about this. But because this philosopher I'm speaking about, Veronica Bregg, who also writes a lot about giving birth, she has recently published a lot of work about sexual difference and about what it is to be a woman. And you made a comment earlier about Harvest and the queer child. So I'm assuming you're closer to the position of many in the room where we think that Cabrera's work is really problematic in that regard. And it's really difficult to think about invitable birth without falling back into some form of essentialism. But what I can hear from the conversation is that you're managing to kind of avoid those connections between motherhood and womanhood, and that you can really want to just think about the physicality of giving birth Yeah, and
Yeah, and I'm really glad you brought this up because this is something that I think is a real risk as well. It feels like a risk to me when I'm writing about this. It feels really essential to do it. And my fear is that it becomes really closely aligned with an essentialist project. But I think what I hope is I want to try and find more ways to do this. I mean, I think, for example, we haven't spoken about abortion, but it feels really important for me to mention that at this point and to talk about Annie Ernaux, who says that her abortionist is her mother. The woman who gave birth to her is the person who procured her abortion for her. And I think that for me, I have never felt closer to my trans siblings than when experiencing hormonal vertigo. Like this gives me some sort of sense of chemical experience that I think is a real bridge between different. Maybe this falls back on essentialism as well. I don't know. It's a sort of speculative thought at this point, but I remember after giving birth, reading about the hormonal load that. It's the biggest shift in anyone's life, the 3 days after giving birth. So rapid, the hormone levels are immense. But, you know, at that point, it really made me think about the experiences of trans people, the availability of hormones and treatment in a way that felt really newly pressing to me, just being at that precipice myself of hormonal change and realizing how important this is. I don't think that really answers your question, but it's really important to me to think about this in ways that don't fall into those traps of saying this is only the experience of a particular kind of mother.
I think that's very interesting, isn't it? Because all through pregnancy, anybody who said to me, but people get frustrated, says, I wanted to get a gun and shoot myself. That's how bad it was. And I just thought, oh, that's you, that's not me. And I was just so full of oxytocin. And then you're right, suddenly it's all gone and all the other stuff comes in. And it's really kind of.
Alongside all that visceral stuff.
It's like nature's going,
and you know, we experience it again as I am doing now as you approach perimenopause, like, you know, but I've never been more aware of myself as a chemical being than I was in those days after giving birth as well. So this is about viscera, but it's also chemical. We're chemical animals.
That sounds like a good place to leave it. We can enhance our animal chemicalness with some wine. Before we thank Naomi, I'd like to say that there are copies of the book available at the back of the room, and I think that Naomi signed the books, but if you'd like a personal dedication, I'm sure I'd be delighted. Naomi would be delighted to do that, but please join me in thanking Naomi for that.